Welcome everyone to Insights into the Weekly Haftorah. This coming week is Parasha Tetzaveh. This is the second portion in a row that we'll be talking about the making of the Mishkan. And here it also includes the clothing of the Kohanim, especially the clothing of the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, and also the ritual through which they were anointed and brought into the service, how they would be when the Mishkan was erected, how they would become official Kohanim, and how the vessels would be anointed in order to begin the service in the temple. So one would expect that the Haftorah coming from the prophets would have something to do with the temple. Last week was Parasha Truma, and we saw that the Haftorah was from the Book of Kings, and it told about how King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, began to build the temple, just like in Parasha Truma is the beginning of building the Mishkan. But the Haftorah this week is from Ezekiel, Yechezkel, the 43rd chapter. Actually starts in the middle of the chapter, and it goes from the 10th verse to the 27th verse. What's the connection with the Parsha? Here, we have to understand that Yechezkel, he was taken to Babylonia 10 years before the destruction of the temple. He was among what was called the upper classes. He was a Kohen, and Nebuchadnezzar took a whole group of people already into exile in Babylonia 10 years before the destruction of the temple. So here we're in the 43rd chapter. We're getting towards the end of the book of Yechezkel. And before, he's prophesying about how the people should do tshuva and avoid the temple being destroyed. But of course, it was destroyed. And he was in Babylonia already. He didn't live through the destruction, whereas Jeremiah did. Jeremiah was in Israel at the destruction of the temple. But here in the 43rd chapter, he starts to give over a prophecy about the future temple. Now, what's interesting is we understand it as the measurements. It's a lot of details here, a lot of measurements for the building of the third temple. But what's interesting is when he gave this over, the second temple hadn't even been built yet. And here he's giving over already for a future temple. As I said, there are many, many details here. And it should be mentioned that many of these dimensions were at odds with the first temple. And so the sages had quite a hard time understanding the prophecy, because in certain respects it mirrored the first temple, but in other respects it didn't. But of course, this is a vision of the future, so they didn't know how to relate to it. And there was actually an opinion not to include the Book of Ezekiel, or at least the descriptions of this future temple, because it might confuse people. In the end, they didn't agree with this opinion, and so it is found here. The Haftorah here is just the beginning, and it goes on for many chapters, all kinds of details about the dedication of the temple and the Kohanim and the Leviim and the building of it and the measurements. But here, most of the attention is given to the altar. The altar where the offerings are brought. So what's interesting is that when he's describing the measurements of the altar and where it would be and how to purify it and to sanctify it, he gives names to different parts of the altar. So the top of the altar, he gave a name, Har El, the mountain of God. Now, these names don't appear anyplace else in the Tanakh. These were names that Yechezkel gave. So the top of the altar was called Har El, the mountain of God. What's interesting, and just an aside, the name of my home insurance company is called Harel. From right here. This is where it comes from. The top of the mountain, actually, literally the mountain of God. Har is a mountain, El is God, Har El. But here, Yechezkel is calling the top of the altar the mountain of God. And then he calls the fire on top of the altar, he calls that Ariel, which means the lion of God. And Ari is the lion of God. And of course, this is connected to the great Kabbalist, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, who's called the Ari Zal, Zikrono Lebracha, the Ari, the holy lion. Some say it's Ashkenaz Rebbe Yitzchak. His name was Yitzchak Luria. And some say that Ari is an acronym for Ashkenazi Rebbe Yitzchak. But it also means a lion. And in fact, the students of the Arizal were called the lion cubs, like the students of the king of the jungle, the lion cubs. And the bottom of the altar, he called it the Azara, which is like the courtyard. So it's just interesting that these names are important. And Azara actually in the temple was the courtyard of the temple, but he applied that same name to the bottom of the altar. So I just wanted to give over just a little bit about the altar. In Hebrew, the altar is called a mizbeach. A zevach is a sacrifice, is an offering, a zevach. When you put a mem in front of a word like this, it means the place of sacrifice. That's literally what the altar means in Hebrew. Mizbeach is the mem, it means the place of zevach. Just like, for example, a hotel is called a malon. Lon means a place of sleeping. The mem is a place where people sleep, is called a malon. The temple itself is called Beit HaMikdash. Mikdash is Kodesh. The mem is the place of holiness. Mikdash, the place of Kodesh, the place of holiness. So the Mizbeach is the place of sacrifice, of offerings. The numerical value of Mizbeach is 57. And what's very interesting is the 23rd Psalm, maybe the most famous of all Psalms, is "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." That's the 23rd Psalm. And in Hebrew and English, it's really one of the most known of all of the Psalms. The Arizal, his custom was to say this psalm at each meal. before making Kiddush, he would make Kiddush at the third meal also. And he would say Mizmor LeDavid before Kiddush. Now we in Nusach Sfard and Sfardi, we included in Friday night's prayers. And even on the Ari's tombstone, on his grave, is written this idea of Mizmor LeDavid. Now, why am I mentioning this? Because Mizmor LeDavid has 57 words. It's the same as Mizbeach. Mizbeach, the altar, is 57 words, and the 23rd Psalm is 57 words. It also has 227 letters. 227 is Gematria Bracha, blessing. And so you can understand why the Ari wanted it as part of the making Kiddush on Shabbos, is because we're told that once the temple was destroyed, well, what happened to all the offerings? We don't bring offerings anymore. We don't have an altar. We don't have the service in the temple. But the sages said our prayers have replaced the offerings. And so the Mizbeach, the altar, represents, it's a place of offering. So when we go to a synagogue, to the Beit Knesset, the place where the Torah is read, and in many shuls where the person leading the prayers prays from, is called the Bama, which is like the altar. And further, we're told that we don't have the service in the temple anymore. We don't have the altar, but we also don't have the 12 loaves of bread, the showbread, the table. It's called a shulchan, a table of showbread. So we're told that in our reality today, our table is like the Mizbeach, is like the altar. And that's why on all of the offerings, salt was put. That's why when we eat bread, we always dip it in salt to remind us that our eating should be like an offering to God, and that our table should be holy like the Mizbeach, like the altar. So all of this is just to kind of fill in this Haftorah, which, like I said, has a lot of details, but we don't want to lose the forest for the trees. We want to understand the importance of the Mizbeach, the idea of a place of offering. So our homes have become a place of offering. Our tables, the synagogue, the Beit Knesset, these are all places where we offer prayer and praises and literally our heart and soul to God. May we merit to see the third temple, and we should all continue to offer up our best to God.